So, hello, BookTube. This is Mika, and this is my book haul. So, as you can see, it's a quite heavy and large pile of books, but if you're anything like me, you curate your collection in a very slow and organic kind of way. I'm not here to disparage anyone on this channel. So I don't disparage people who are going to the big chain bookshops and who are buying only new releases and dropping a ton of money all at once. But that's just not necessarily something that I do. And again, I don't disparage anyone. So if you have a large book collection, then that's perfectly fine. But as you've seen, mine is quite curated because I just believe that knowledge is something to be shared, it's something to be disseminated. And something that really concerns me within South Africa and within KZN particularly is that you have these bullshit politicians going into rural areas and saying, hey, look at me, snapping a bunch of pictures and saying, oh, look, I opened a library. But the concern is that you opened one and you closed three. And even when people open these libraries, they're stuffing it with these irrelevant idiot books that children don't need. So we're in a climate where 80% of our 10-year-olds cannot read for meaning. They are functionally illiterate in every single language. And if anything, the books that they need are the ones that connect to their lived experience. So, I've seen South African books where it talks about life in a township, life in rural areas. My gogo told me these kinds of experiences that will touch readers emotionally, because ultimately I think that's how you get people into reading to begin with. If it's these dry, boring, textbook like kind of books, then again, what is the incentive for readers to come into stories? If you think about stories, it's such an ancient thing. Like from being in the cave people times, people would get around a campfire and tell stories, and it would be this emotional, partly spiritual, bonding, communal kind of experience. And I think books, at least when I first started reading, that's what books were for me, and that's what they meant to me. Books can take on a more intellectual feel and a more, yeah, I don't know, dry feel as you get older. But yeah, anyway, I take it upon myself to donate books to local libraries, to that KZN street lit thing, and yeah, again, just disseminate knowledge wherever I can. Because, and a lot of people would say, no, as a South African citizen, it's not my job to do XYZ. It's not my job to do what the public servants should be doing, what the politicians should be doing. But if it's not your job, then whose job is it? Because you can't rely on politicians, you can't rely on public servants. I think we all need to be active citizens wherever possible. But let me just shut up now and do the rest of the whole. So I'll just show you where they come from as well, because in case you want some bookshop recommendations. So this first one was actually free. It's from a friend, and I say it's free because obviously she lent it to me. It's not mine to keep. So I'll just talk about this in a lot more detail in like a review discussion kind of video. But it's actually soon to be an Apple TV series, so I believe this book is relatively well known. Don't necessarily need to talk about it a lot. But these two are from a bookshop in the Midlands, and they specialize in Africana and collectibles and nonfiction and that kind of thing. So again, I do enjoy the bookshops that focus on Africana because there's so much American and British cultural imperialism when it comes to books. In the most remote areas, you can find a Bible, you can find American popular fiction. But again, I think things like Africana are also important. So that kind of goes onto the topic of why I picked this book. So it's Tibet, My Story by Jetson Pema, sister of the Dalai Lama. I'm not here to deify the Dalai Lama and say he's perfect, because he's human. But China is a superpower on the world stage, and I think a lot of South Africans don't know enough about China, and we should. So speaking of cultural imperialism, with Soviet occupation, they squashed things like Belarusian culture, Ukrainian culture. Within the Chinese concentration camps, they've put Uyghur Muslims in there. There's been Japanese occupation of Korea. I don't want to hear about that from the perspective of a Japanese soldier feeling sad. I I want to hear about that from the perspective of a Korean person. I want to hear about Chinese occupation of Tibet from a Tibetan perspective. I want to hear from a Ukrainian perspective, because otherwise these cultures get lost to time. history is written by the victor, and I don't want to hear from the victor only. Funding is pumped into the victor's perspective. The news sources will tend to cover that, and so it's just not my interest. I'm not someone who believes in preservation of culture and tradition just for the sake of that, because then I think you can fall into very rigid mindsets and fear-based mindsets. But at the same time, I do believe in championing voices that would otherwise be suppressed. So that's the point of picking this up. So it's the younger sister of the Dalai Lama, and it's a story about Tibet before Chinese invasion. This next one is 300 Tang Poems, the Far East book by Chiang Li. So I can't read Cantonese, Mandarin, anything like that. But I just love poetry, and I thought it would be fascinating to look into some Chinese history, just, yeah, some poetry, because it's, again, culturally so beautiful. I love Chinese, what do you call them? Hanfu. So the clothing, again, I think is absolutely stunning. I've read some things from the Far East, but it's like, Tao Te Ching, nothing, yeah, nothing so pertinent, I will say. So that's just something that I would like to learn a lot more about. This next one is To My Children's Children, and this is by Siniwe Magona. And I've read two by her. I've read Forced to Grow and Living, Loving, and Lying Awake at Night. So those are fascinating, and I just don't need any convincing to read more Siniwe Magona. This is written essentially as a letter from a Xhosa grandmother to record her life in South Africa for her grandchildren so that they do not lose their own history. It's her account of her eventful first 23 years. And again, I don't know about losing Xhosa history. I don't know if that's necessarily possible, considering how, maybe not, but like isiZulu culture, Xhosa culture, it's these large empires, almost, if you can call it like that. So with monarchies and very sophisticated social stratification and all of that. So again, I don't know that necessarily your history is going to get lost, but I do admire her writing this down, because a lot of Xhosa and Zulu history is oral tradition. So her early years were in a Transkei village, and her childhood and adolescence on the Cape Flats, in retreat, and later Guguletu, where she was poor but secure in a loving family. So again, it just speaks of her experience, and I will most likely do a discussion review type video, because I definitely want to champion South African voices like this on my channel. Not that she needs any championing, she is very much a celebrity within South Africa, but I think her voice should be alive, and that us newer generations should also be reading her works. So this is by George Alagia, A Passage to Africa. And so within Africa, and when people hear about racial conflicts, they generally hear about black and white, which is fine, that does exist. But there is Indian presence within Africa, and specifically with British indenture and those kinds of things, and how these racial conflicts and how xenophobia affects that community is just not covered by the media at all. And I think it's definitely something, it's stories that deserve to exist. Like, I'm not saying we mustn't have anything about the racial conflicts between black and white, but we definitely need to have a lot of different perspectives. So on the back of the book it says, I want you to do me a favor. I'd like you to forget much of what you think you know about Africa. So George Alagia, when he was 5 years old, he and his family emigrated from Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to Ghana. It was a journey laced with hope. The Alagias were a family fleeing ethnic conflict for the first African country to gain independence from the British Empire. And when Accra hosted the 1965 Organization for African Unity Summit, anything seemed possible. But just 12 short months later, a coup d'etat brought this childlike optimism to a close. From these formative childhood years to his time as the BBC's Africa correspondent, A Passage to Africa is George Alagia's powerful testament to the continent in which he feels at home. With unblinking candor and compelling insight, he chronicles the horror, the hope, and the humanity he has borne witness to, from Mobutu to Mugabe, Somalia to South Africa. And with Nelson Mandela drawing the era of national liberation to a close, he looks to the future and to the African Renaissance, led by such leaders as Yoweri Museveni and Thabo Mbeki. Now, Thabo Mbeki is not a figure that a lot of South Africans look upon kindly, because of Thabo Mbeki's anti-intellectualism, his active resistance to complex thought or anything like that. Yeah, I just won't go into that. Maybe when I'm discussing this book in a longer video, we can go into a bit more detail. This is V.S. Naipaul, A Bend in the River. And my parents grew up during racial segregation within South Africa, so they lived in predominantly Indian spaces. So my father was maybe a bit more of an industrial kind of situation, and my mother was in a very rural, very remote area. So because it was so rural and so remote, you didn't really have apartheid government or police coming in and trying to enforce racial segregation laws. So again, just extremely rural, extremely remote. But they both, within their schools, because the schools were predominantly Indian, they studied V.S. Naipaul. And V.S. Naipaul covers, I think it's like, okay, so the book is called A House for Mr. Biswas, and I think it's set in Mauritius or something. So it's that same indentured history and Indian presence in other places. So Indian diaspora, but not your like American Indians that a lot of people know now, where they were settlers and they chose to be there, and there's this sort of model minority myth, and there's a lot of still racism, colorism, all of these issues within the Indian diaspora. I think Americans are called ABCDs, American born confused Desis. So because apparently they don't know their culture and all of that, and so the way a lot of these Americans connect with their culture, so to speak, is by watching Bollywood movies, which I just think is absolutely ridiculous, and I'm not going to get into that. But this, A Bend in the River, Salim recognizes that what he makes of himself is up to him alone. His forebears, who came from India to live on the east coast of Africa, began a line of people who must flourish without the support provided by attachment to one place and its traditions. When Salim is offered a small business in Central Africa, he accepts. Accompanied by Meti, a son of one of the family's slaves, he travels a long way into the heart of the continent and becomes a trader in the town on a bend in the river, a town built by Europeans on the site of an old Arab settlement, now without Arabs and almost without Europeans. So you can see that Salim's family owns a slave. So generally that's what Muslim settlers in Africa did. And I remember a Muslim woman telling me in the year 2023 about how I think their families, like gardener and domestic worker, had a child, so now they own the child according to the Quran or whatever. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous, the story that she told me. And I mean, she was saying, no, it sounds bad, but the way that my father said it and whatever. And I was just shocked, like, no comment. But I will just say, please don't think that Indian presence in Africa is only this perspective and only coming from a Muslim perspective where slaves exist and are owned and all of that. That's just not, yeah, that's not acceptable. Let me move on. Okay, so this is Albie Sachs, We the People, Insights of an Activist Judge. So he was one of the first constitutional court judges, and when you read the older constitutional court judgments, like the legal reasoning is so sophisticated, it is so well researched, and it is so aligned with leftist thought, ideology, academia. It is fascinating to read. It's so well structured. It's amazing. Like, the first time I read a constitutional court judgment was in 2020. It was my first year of my law degree, and it was S versus Makonyana, and it was about the death penalty in South Africa and why the state should not be allowed to have that amount of power, because that power can so easily be abused. And if we have a Bill of Rights, but the state is allowed to take away one of those rights in the Bill of Rights, so namely the right to life, then what's the point of having a Bill of Rights? Because essentially the state can act in an arbitrary manner. And yeah, again, it's incredibly sophisticated legal reasoning. And it said that the courts and the state should not resort and lower itself to populism. You know, populism will say, no, we must just kill people that we feel like killing. Oh, this person's a rapist, this person's a murderer, you know, you must just kill them. And it's this emotion, but that can lead to mob mentalities, that can lead to a lot of issues. So again, Albie Sachs is fantastic. Edwin Cameron is fantastic. Like, I really need to read a lot more about their perspectives and how they came to be and the work that they've done and all of that, and just essentially continue their legacy. So this next one is Mythographic Odyssey by Joseph Kattenbang, and I bought this from Take A Lot. So you'll see it's very intricate, and it's those adult coloring books. So in the major chain stores like exclusive books and bargain books, I haven't necessarily seen any mythographic on the shelves, because they have to keep what sells. Have to keep their doors open. So I generally would have to order anything like this, mythographic, and yeah, I just love it. A lot of people tend not to like these because they say no, it's the drawings are way too complex and there's too many details and it's intimidating. But I don't know, I really enjoy getting stuck in, and it's very meditative. So just to show you some other things that I've gotten at a bookshop. So this was at the SPCA bookshop, where they just had like scrapbooking supplies. They had this book. I'm very prolific when it comes to journaling, so I bought this A4 384 page. It's huge. So just to show you, this is also a book from a grocery store. It's 288 pages, and within the space of 4 months, I've only got a tiny little bit to fill up. So again, I tend to be very prolific with journaling, so I need to not buy like super expensive supplies because I go through them quite quickly. And yeah, the SPCA bookshop has like a haberdashery. It's got all of these arts and crafts things, so I think it's definitely a good place to. So again, let me just show you what's SPCA. So these books were from the SPCA. The last book that I'm going to show you and talk about is from a small printing press, and again, this is about Indian experience within South Africa, but specifically working class and specifically indentured experience, because there's a lot of trauma there, and intergenerational trauma and epigenetic trauma and all of these things, which it's important to explore. It's important to tell the stories, because history is generally written by the victor. And yeah, I think because some of the last indentured laborers came to South Africa in like 1910, 1915. So to essentially come from slavery and 1920s and essentially these British colonials owning you, and then shortly thereafter, like within one lifetime, experiencing racial segregation, I just think is insane. And it's a kind of trauma that's never really explored within a lot of books, because it's not prioritized by South African publishers. It's just, a lot of us are shoved to the sidelines, and the average South African doesn't know the story at all. And so again, I just think it's important, and it's an important part of history, not to preserve, not to hold on to tradition or to cling or anything like that. But I think we just need a lot of different stories. Like a lot of white South African authors would explore military trauma and the privilege and the heaviness of that, and knowing that as an individual citizen, they might not necessarily have a lot of power to stand up to the government and to speak truth to power, so to speak. And there's obviously the Anglo-Boer War and Afrikaans people being put in concentration camps. Again, issues of cultural imperialism, whether that's from an Afrikaans perspective or an English perspective. There's, a lot of white South Africans deal with those kinds of issues, and obviously with the racism and how that seeps into family and intergenerational dynamics. You get a lot of black authors, again, writing specifically about racism and systemic and spatial apartheid, historical injustice, which we need all of those voices to see South Africa as the whole that it is. Our colored authors will tend to also explore issues of slavery, specifically Cape Malay people, and the stratifications within the Muslim community. So if you're this type of Muslim or that type of Muslim, if you're Indonesian descent or Indian descent, or again, those stratifications and how prejudice seeps in. So that's again what a lot of colored people will talk about, and also being on the fringes of the different race groups. So colored within South Africa is a term to describe people of mixed race and mixed descent. But I think Indian voices have really not been heard. So I say that I bought this from an independent and a small printing press, because if you don't buy these books, if you don't support these books, they generally go out of print. And again, when I say history is written by the victor, all of that Gandhi worship shit and caste denialism and only Muslim Bania voices, again, the traders and these privileged perspectives, they will tend to prevail over these indentured perspectives, which is very much needed. But anyway, that is the end of the book haul, and I hope you enjoyed. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day.